When experience became a blind spot, they trusted it because it had never failed them. Years of hard-earned lessons. Scars turned into instincts. Instincts turned into certainty. Experience felt like vision, until it quietly replaced it. This matters today because experience is supposed to sharpen judgment. But when the world changes faster than memory updates, experience can become a filter that blocks what no longer looks familiar. What once protected leaders begins to limit what they can see. The billionaire at the center of this story had earned their confidence. Every major inflection point in the empire's rise had been navigated with pattern recognition. They knew how cycles turned. They knew how bubbles burst. They knew what signals mattered and which ones faded. That knowledge built success. The reveal began with repetition. New situations were evaluated through old comparisons. Decisions were framed as versions of something already seen. Risks were categorized quickly because they resembled past risks. The future felt manageable because it looked explainable. The empire moved with calm precision. Experience shortened debates. Experience settled arguments. Experience reduced uncertainty. And that felt like mastery. But mastery carries a quiet assumption that the next challenge will resemble the last one enough to recognize it. That assumption went untested for years because it kept working. The billionaire noticed fewer surprises. Outcomes aligned with expectation. Markets behaved predictably. Each correct call reinforced trust in the lens experience provided. The blind spot formed there. New data that didn't fit existing patterns felt noisy. Behaviors that didn't match historical precedent felt immature. Opportunities that lacked familiar markers felt speculative. Experience labeled them efficiently. Too early, too small, too unclear. The reveal deepened as younger teams brought forward ideas that couldn't be explained through precedent. The concepts weren't flawed. They were unfamiliar. And unfamiliar felt unreliable when compared to proven memory. The billionaire didn't dismiss these ideas aggressively. They were acknowledged, considered, then measured against what experience already knew, and experience always won. The organization mistook confidence for clarity. Decisions felt safe. Direction felt justified. But something subtle had changed. The empire was no longer learning at the same speed it was deciding. Experience had become a shortcut, not to wisdom, but to dismissal. The conflict was forming quietly, not because experience was wrong, but because it had stopped being questioned. And once experience becomes unquestionable, it stops evolving. Because the greatest risk of experience is not arrogance, it's invisibility. The moment it becomes a blind spot, the future starts arriving disguised as noise, and no one hears it coming. The blind spot widened through efficiency. Experience made decisions faster, not better. Meetings shortened. Debate narrowed. Alternatives were filtered out early because they didn't resemble anything that had worked before. The reveal continued as learning slowed. Teams stopped exploring unfamiliar paths unless asked directly. Proposals were framed to match historical wins. Language shifted subtly. Ideas were justified by resemblance to the past instead of relevance to the future. The billionaire interpreted this as alignment. Everyone spoke the same strategic language. Everyone understood the same risks. Everyone moved with confidence. But confidence is not curiosity. The conflict sharpened when external shifts appeared that refused to fit known categories. New behaviors emerged without precedent. Value moved in ways models didn't predict. The empire tracked the changes carefully, then explained them away. It's cyclical. It's temporary. We've seen this before. Those phrases felt reassuring. Experience provided answers before questions could fully form. Instead of asking what was changing, leadership focused on why it would revert. Instead of investigating unfamiliar signals, they waited for them to mature into something recognizable. The billionaire felt no urgency. After all, experience said this phase would pass. The reveal deepened when early movers began benefiting from the very signals the empire had dismissed. Their approaches looked messy, their metrics incomplete, but their momentum grew. They weren't waiting for validation. They were building it. Inside the empire, those same signals still looked unconvincing because experience was measuring them against the wrong yardstick. The emotional tension surfaced when a promising internal experiment was paused for lack of historical comparison. Leadership asked reasonable questions. Where's the precedent? What's the benchmark? How does this scale? The answers were uncertain. And uncertainty felt irresponsible when compared to comfort of knowing how things used to work. The conflict was no longer about rejecting new ideas. It was about not recognizing them. Experience had become a gatekeeper for legitimacy. If something couldn't be explained through memory, it struggled to be taken seriously, even if it pointed toward the future. The blind spot wasn't created by ignorance. It was created by familiarity. And the more experience solved problems quickly, the less space remained to notice problems that didn't yet look like problems at all. Because when experience answers too fast, it prevents the question that matters most. What if this time is different? The conflict reached its peak when experience finally failed to predict outcomes. A decision that should have stabilized the situation didn't. A pattern that should have repeated broke unexpectedly. The familiar playbook produced unfamiliar results. The billionaire felt the shock not as panic, but as confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. The emotional peak arrived during a review meant to explain the miss. Data was reanalyzed, assumptions revisited. Every explanation still relied on historical logic, and yet none of it restored confidence. The past had stopped explaining the present. That was the moment the blind spot became visible. Experience had trained the empire to recognize echoes of what had already happened, but not signals of what had never existed before. The organization had optimized for recognition, not discovery. The conflict deepened when leaders realized that competitors who lacked experience were adapting faster. They weren't smarter. They weren't better resourced. They simply weren't constrained by memory. They experimented freely, learned publicly, and adjusted without waiting for precedent. The billionaire saw the contrast clearly. Experience was creating certainty, but certainty was creating delay. Every unfamiliar move had to be justified against history. Every new direction required validation from the past. And while the empire waited for familiarity, others were shaping reality in real time. The realization carried weight. Experience had not become wrong. It had become insufficient. The conflict crystallized into a difficult question. Could the empire continue trusting experience as its primary lens, knowing it filtered out the unfamiliar? Or could it relearn how to see without needing recognition first? Because the future does not repeat the past cleanly. It mutates. And experience, when treated as authority instead of input, becomes blind to mutation. The next step would not be about discarding what was known. It would be about deciding whether experience would remain the judge of what mattered, or simply one voice among many. Because when experience becomes unquestionable, it stops protecting you. It protects yesterday instead. The climax arrived when the billionaire chose to demote experience from authority to advisor, not to dismiss it, but to remove its veto power over the future. Experience would inform decisions, not decide which questions were allowed. The shift was intentional. Leaders were encouraged to pursue ideas without precedent. Experiments were funded even when historical comparison was impossible. Success was defined by learning velocity, not immediate validation. Experience remained valuable, but it no longer controlled relevance. The resolution unfolded through curiosity. New signals were explored without forcing them into old categories. Younger teams were trusted to interpret behavior before it matured into familiar metrics. The organization relearned how to sit with uncertainty without rushing to explain it away. The empire began seeing again, not because it knew less, but because it allowed itself to not know. The billionaire reflected on the lesson with clarity earned through limitation. Experience is powerful because it compresses learning. It is dangerous when it compresses vision. By allowing unfamiliar patterns to exist without immediate explanation, the empire regained adaptability. It did not abandon its history. It stopped letting history dictate the future. Because the most valuable insight is not recognizing what you've seen before. It's recognizing what you've never seen at all. And when leaders make room for that recognition, experience stops being a blind spot. It becomes a foundation, flexible enough to support what comes next rather than blocking it. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When experience